Masechet Shevuot Daf Chaf Bet. Amru lo l'Rabbi Akiva hechan masinu vechule. And the Mishnah taught that according to Rabbi Akiva, if someone makes a vow, says, I'm not going to eat, and then he eats just a little bit less than a kezait, he is liable to bring a korban. Whereas Chachamim disagree. They say, if I make a vow, I'm not going to eat, then I'm not liable unless I eat a kezait. The other rabbis asked Rabbi Akiva, where do we ever find in the Torah that one is liable to bring a korban for eating just a little bit? Generally is a certain size. You have a minimal size, usually a kezait. So that's their question. We're going to ask a question on that question. Velo, is it true that there's no other cases in the Torah where one would be liable to bring a korban for eating less than a kezait? Vehare nemala. What about eating an ant? If someone eats an ant, then they are liable to bring a korban. Not just one, several korbanot, and that's smaller than a kezait. And the answer is bidya shane. A whole being is different because it's an entire being, so it doesn't have to be a kezait. The law of a kezait is if you're eating cheleb, which is there's a large amount of cheleb. So if you just eat a little bit, it's no liability, but you have to have a certain amount of eating because not chashuv, it's not considered an act of eating. It's not significant unless it's a kezait. However, a whole being is significant in and of itself because it's a whole being. It's created that way as an ant. That's just its size. So that's why that's different from other prohibitions. V'harei hekdesh. What about hekdesh? Someone who eats even a little bit of hekdesh is liable, even less than a kezait. He says, no, that also has a size. Ha'ba'inan shaveh peruta. One is only liable if they eat from sacrificial food that they're not allowed to eat, if they eat at least one peruta's worth. It has to be a significant amount in terms of its price. And so, yes, that very, very well likely may be less than a kezait, but there is a minimum size. It's not kol shehu, so the rabbi's question is upheld. We don't find in the rest of the Torah that a kol shehu one would be liable. Wait, what about someone who specifies? He makes a vow and he specifies, I'm not going to eat tomorrow, not even a little bit. So that's a case where the Torah would make one liable for eating kol shehu. And the answer, mefaresh name kibirya dameh. If someone specifies, that's the same as a birya. The point of a birya is that in people's minds, an ant is a significant thing because it's a whole being. And therefore the same thing. If someone says, I'm not even going to eat one grain, then they are liable because they're making that one grain important. It's important to them. And that's why one is liable. But otherwise, it's not. In other words, only if one goes out of his way and says, oh, a tiny bit is liable, or if naturally most people think that it's a significant thing like a whole being, then yes. But otherwise, in standard formulation, if you just say I'm not going to eat, then it's not called eating unless it's a kezait. V'harei afar ela tifshot ba'eraba shevuah shelo ochal v'achal afar bechama tifshot ad ika kezait. What about dirt? If someone makes a vow and says I'm not going to eat, and then they ate dirt, which is not food, so does that have the same law according to Rabbanan that you'd also need a kezait? Or maybe the size is a shiur kezait is a shiur for food. Food is not considered significant until it's a kezait, like an olive, which is also food. But if someone eats dirt and you consider that an act of eating, maybe you don't need a kezait, maybe that's only kol shehu. Now this question was asked by Rava and he left it standing. He asked, if someone makes a vow that I'm not going to eat, and then they eat dirt, so they should be liable, but the question is how much? Is it even a little bit because it's not food, or do you treat it the same as everything else, that you need a kezait? Now Rava didn't have an answer, but based on this Mishnah, he should have had an answer because here we see that the rabbis say there's no prohibition in the Torah that one is liable for kol shehu. So we could have resolved Rava's question. Rava could have resolved his own question by setting this Mishnah and proving that you need a kezayit of dirt in order to be liable. So why didn't he resolve it over there? And the answer is ki kamrinan b'midi debar achila kamrinan. No, when the rabbi said in this Mishnah that one is not liable to bring a korban unless they eat a kezayit, we mean unless they eat food, something that is edible in the amount of a kezayit. But it could very well be that when it comes to something inedible, one would be liable if one ate less than a kezayit. And that's why we cannot resolve this question about dirt from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is talking about food. Vare kunamot. What about kunamot? Kunamot is a type of vow where you say, this thing is prohibited to me like a korban. And over there, that's prohibited even less than a kezayit. Someone who just gets benefit from it is already liable to a korban. And the answer is kunamot name kim faresh tameh. Kunamot is also like specifying even if I eat a little bit. As we're going to see in a minute, kunam is different from a normal vow because in a normal vow say I'm not going to eat tomorrow. Whereas a kunam you say this thing is prohibited to me. You don't say the verb eat. You just say prohibited to me. So since you're saying prohibited to me, and you're not saying the verb eat, therefore any benefit from it is prohibited, whether it's an act of eating or not an act of eating. And since that the formulation is different, that the formulation of a kunam is equivalent to and the formulation of saying eating even a little bit, because he's saying it's just prohibited to me no matter what. Amar lehen, hechan masinu b'medaber umevi korban shezeh medaber umevi korban. Now in the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva responds to the rabbis and says, well, yes, you're pointing out, rabbis, that this is unique. Indeed, it is unique because there's another unique factor that everybody would agree to. Where do we ever see in the Torah that someone speaks and just by speaking, he is liable to bring a korban? But here, that is the case. Someone speaks and says, I'm not going to eat tomorrow, and then they end up eating. They make themselves liable and they have to bring a korban. Where else in the Torah do you have such a thing? So therefore, just like this is special in that you speak and bring a korban, so too, Rabbi Akiva says, I think it's special in that even if you eat a kol shehu, one is liable. Because the point is that you created a prohibition by speaking, and by when you eat, you're violating that speech act. It's not a law of eating like other things, like chele, where you can't eat. Here, you cannot violate your words. And so a swear is, in fact, a different type of prohibition than other eating prohibitions, and that's why it's a kol shehu. Now we're going to ask a question about this statement of Rabbi Akiva. Velo, really? You never find that someone does a word, says words, and then is liable to bring a korban? Vare megadef, someone who curses the name of Hashem, he says words and he has to bring a korban. And the answer is medaber ve'oser kamrinan v'hai medaber ve'chotehu. No, Rabbi Akiva was saying, where do we ever find that someone speaks and creates a prohibition? This guy, he spoke and he sinned. For the megadef, the speech itself is a sin, and by sinning, he has to bring korban. Yes, but I'm talking about someone who speaks, and by speaking creates a prohibition upon himself, and then if he violates that prohibition, he has to bring korban. So there's nothing quite like a shevuah. Megadef is different. V'hadeh nazir. What about a nazir? He speaks, and he doesn't sin just by speaking. He speaks and says, I'll be a nazir, and he creates prohibitions upon himself from drinking wine and so on. And if he violates it, then he has to bring korban. And when he ends it, he has to bring a korban. So isn't that the same? Maybe korbano al diburo kamrinan v'hai maybe korban ishteruyeh lechamrahu dekamaiteh. No, Rabbi Akiva was saying someone has to bring a korban for speaking, but this person, he doesn't have to bring a korban because he spoke, but rather because he wants to permit himself to drinking wine. We're talking about at the end, if he finished his 30 days or however long he said he's going to be a nazir. So if he doesn't bring a korban, he can't drink wine. But he doesn't actually have to bring a korban. If he just wants to continue not drinking wine, he has to drink wine he has to bring korban in order to be able to drink wine. So it's not that the speech made him bring a korban. Rather, the speech, yes, it's true, made a prohibition, but he has to bring a korban just to allow himself wine. It's not the violation of the prohibition that made him bring a korban. That's different from a Shevuot, where it's the Shevuot that creates a prohibition, and the violation of the prohibition makes him bring a korban. So there's nothing quite like Shevuot. Nazir is still a little different. Vare hekdesh. And what about hekdesh? There, someone says a speech and says, this animal is hekdesh. And then he makes a prohibition, and if he would use it, then you would have to bring a korban, because that would be me'ilah. Or said lasmo kamdin and vahay, or said al kol halam kulohu. No, this is also different from a Shevuah, because if I make my animal hekdesh, it's prohibited not just to me, but it's prohibited to everybody in the world. No one in the world can use it. If anyone in the world comes and benefits from it, that would be me'ilah. That's different from a Shevuah, where when I make a Shevuah, it's only upon myself. I say, I'm not going to eat this thing tomorrow, but other people can eat it. So that's not exactly the same. So Rabbi Akiva has upheld that Shevuah is still different from other things. Hare kunamot. What about kunamot, where I make a kunam, I say this thing is like a korban. To me, it's only prohibited to me. It's not prohibited to everybody else. And yet, if I violate a kunam, I have to bring korban. Is me'ilah, right? And the answer is no, not necessarily. Kasabar and me'ilah b'kunamot. Rabbi Akiva follows the view that when you say a kunam, it's not actually the same as making it a korban. It's more like just making a shevuah. And if one violates it, one does not have to bring a korban, because it's not actually me'ilah. And since you don't have to actually bring a korban for violating a kunam, there is a prohibition, but not a korban. So is Rabbi Akiva's appel. Where do we ever find that someone who speaks and then has to bring a korban and you have to add all these things? Someone who speaks and creates a prohibition, and then by violating that prohibition, and that prohibition only applies to himself, then he has to bring a korban because he violated that prohibition. Indeed, that only applies to a Shevuah, so a Shevuah is unique in this way, and therefore the Rabbi Akiva says it's also unique in this other way, that one is liable for kol shehu. אמר רבא, מחלוקת בסתם, אבל מפרש דברי הכל בכל שהוא, מה טעמה מפרש נמי כבריאת דמה. Rava says that the dispute between Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis is only if someone makes a standard vow, I'm not going to eat. There, the Rabbi Akiva says one is liable to bring korban if he eats a little bit, and the rabbis say only if he eats a kezait. However, everybody would agree if he specifies and says, I am not going to eat even chatzi shiur, I'm not going to eat even a kol shehu, then everybody would agree, even the rabbis would say that if he eats a little bit, then he has to bring korban. Why? Because mefaresh, saying something specific is like a bidya, it's like a whole entity. That just like a whole entity, everybody knows that a whole ant is a significant thing. By saying I'm not going to eat even one grain, you're making even one grain a significant thing. Ve'amar Rava, machloket b'shelo ochal, aval b'shelo etom dibra kol bechol shehu. Rava says that the machloket between Rabbi Akiva and Chachamim is only if he says the language I will not eat. But if he says I will not taste anything, then everyone agrees that's a kol shehu. That's like being mefaresh. You're saying I'm not going to taste. Well, taste is even a little bit. So everybody would agree that one is liable even if he just has a tiny bit. Peshita, isn't that obvious? Because I might have thought that it's like what you people usually say. A lot of times people come and say, oh, I'll just have a taste of it. And then they go and they eat the entire plate. It's just a polite way of saying, I'm not going to stuff my face. I'll have a taste. But really they mean, I'm going to eat. And so I might have thought that here when someone says, I'm not going to taste, they mean the usage of really eating, and therefore one was not reliable. And that's why Rav Haska come teach us that when you say shelo etom, you mean the strict definition of the word to taste. Even tasting a little bit would violate the vow, and one would have to bring a korban. Amar Rav Papa, machloket b'shvuot, aval bekunamot, dibra kol bekol shehu. Rav Papa says that the dispute between Rabbi Akiva and the sages is only regarding a shevuah. However, if someone says a kunam, this food is kunam to me, it's prohibited, like a korban, then everybody would agree that one would be liable even for kol shehu, even for a little bit. My ta'ama kunamot tameh kevan de la kamad kar shemat achila kimfaresh tameh. The reason is because when you say kunam, you don't use a language of eating. You say this food is prohibited to me. Prohibited whatsoever, totally prohibited. Even a little bit of benefit is prohibited, and that's why everyone would agree that for a kunam, one would be liable even for eating a small amount. We have an objection to this. Me'etibe, from a baraita. Shene kunamot mistarfin. Shete shevuot en mistarfin. Rabbi Meir omer kunamot ki shvuot. V'yisal kadate chayab bekol shehu, lama li lesaref. The baraita teaches that if someone makes two kunamot on two different things, he says a kunam that these apples are prohibited to me, and kunam these oranges are prohibited to me, then if he eats, let's say, half a kazait of apples and half a kazait of oranges, they do come together, they join together, and he is liable. But if one makes two Shevuot, he says, I promise I'm not going to eat apples. And then he says, I promise I'm not going to eat oranges. And he eats half a kazait of these and half a kazait of those. They do not join together. That's what the Braita says according to Tanakama. And then Bimir says, Kunamot is the same as Shevuot, just like in Shevuot. We don't join them together. They're two separate vows on two separate things. So you'd have to have a kazait of apples in order to be liable, or a kazait of oranges, but we don't join them together. That's the same thing for Kunamot. They do not join together. Let's focus on Tanakama. If you say, which is what Papa says, that one is liable for Kunamot, even for a little bit, everybody agrees, then why do you need to join them together? If a kunam, that's what he said here, a kunam, everybody agrees, is even a tiny bit. So what does it matter if you join together? Even just having one little bit of apples or one little bit of oranges by itself would make one liable. Good question. And the answer is, Damar achila mizo alai konam. Achila mizo alai konam. We're not talking about a regular case of kunam formula where someone says, this thing is prohibited to me as a kunam, or kunam, this thing to me. That's the normal formula. And that formula says, this thing is prohibited to me no matter how much. Rather, he actually does use the verb to eat. Eating from this is prohibited to me like a kunam. Eating from that is prohibited to me like a kunam. And therefore, since he says the language of eating, it's only if it has a kazait, so he needs to join them together. Yachi amay mistarfot. Well, wait a second. In that case, why should it join together? Sof sof. Zilhacha lekashura. Zilhacha lekashura. Look at the apples. Did he have a kazait of apples? No. So then he shouldn't be liable for the apples, kunam. And how about the kunam he made for oranges? Did he have a kazait for that? No. These are two different kunamot regarding two different things. So why should they join together at all? Damar achila mishtehem alai kunam. Oh, we're talking about a case where he said eating from both of these things is prohibited to me like a kunam. So it's actually one formula that encompasses both of these things. That's why they do, in fact, join together. Okay, so then we ask, well, take the parallel formula when it comes to an oath. If someone says, I make a vow, I'm not going to eat from these apples or oranges, and he eats half a kazait of these and half a kazait of those, then they would join together. So why does Tanakama say that Shevuot is different, that they don't join together? Amara Pinchas, Shane Shevuot mitoch shechalukot lechataot and mistarfot. Rav Pinchas says Shevuot are different. We're going to see in the Mishnah on Amud Bet that if someone says, I make an oath, I'm not going to eat apples and oranges and dates and olives and so on, and then he eats from each one, he has to bring multiple chataot for each item that he ate. And just like we separate the different items on the list regarding a chatat offering, we also separate them in terms of their joining together. They're considered separate. Because the language of Shevuah, even if you say one formula, and in that formula you give a list of 5 things, those 5 things are considered like separate vows. And therefore, just like they're separate vows, lechumra, in that you'd have to bring multiple chatat offerings if you ate a sufficient amount of each, so too, they are considered separate in that they do not join together. But that's a special law of oaths, that of Shevuot that does not apply to kunamot. Ihachi, Rabbi Meir omer kunamot ki Shevuot. Bishlam Shevuot v'chalukot hachataot ela kunamot amai la. If so, that we're going to follow here Rabbi Pinchas, then how can you explain Rabbi Meir? He said kunamot will have the same law as Shevuot. We understand Shevuot because we have the special law that they are considered separate. Every item on the list is considered separate for a chatat offering, so therefore they do not join together. But for kunamot, we don't have that law regarding separating it for chatat offerings. So why would Rabbi Meir say that kunamot do not join together? It's a really good question, so good that we have to change Rabbi Meir's language. Ipuch, Rabbi Meir omer Shevuot ke kunamot, velet le Rav Pinchas. Rabbi Meir actually says Shevuot is like kunamot, just like kunamot join together, so too Shevuot actually do join together according to Rabbi Meir. And what about Rabbi Pinchas? He doesn't agree with Rabbi Pinchas. He says, yes, it's true, Shevuot everything on the list is considered separate when it comes to having to bring a korban hatat, but just because they're considered separate for bringing multiple korban hatats for eating each thing on the list, that doesn't mean that they don't join together. He thinks that they do join together, and you don't bring a parallel from this type of joining to a type of joining for another law. And so therefore Shevuot are like kunamot, and both of them in fact can join together. Ravina Amar ki kamar papa l'inyan malkot ki tanyahi l'inyan korban deba'inan shave peruta. Ravina says, I have a different way of resolving Rav Papa with that baraita. When Rav Papa said that for kunam one is liable even for eating a little bit of kol shehu, that was just for the law of lashes. If someone did it on purpose, they would get lashes even for eating a tiny amount. However, when it comes to if you did it by mistake, and whether you have to bring a korban, there even the Papa would agree that a kol shehu is not sufficient. And in fact, that's what the Baraita is talking about, liability to bring a korban. So when the Baraita says that when you make a kunam on two different items, and you have just a tiny bit of this and a tiny bit of that, they can join together, that was regarding a korban. Why? Why do you need a minimum amount for a korban? Because for a korban, you need to have benefit from at least a shaveh peruta. So if you have just a tiny bit, less than half a peruta of oranges, and less than half a peruta of apples, okay, they're not going to join together. But if it makes up a peruta, then one has to bring a korban. Why? What's the law of shaveh peruta? That has to do with me'ilah. By making something kunam, you're making it like a korban. And same thing, just like kodashim. In order to be liable, one has to benefit at least a shaveh peruta. That's the difference. When it comes to a korban, that's the law of me'ilah. It has to be shaveh peruta. But if someone violates on purpose, then even a kol shehu would get that person malkot. Lememra de sabre Rabbanan yesh me'ilah bakonamot. Ravina seems to be assuming that, according to Rabbanan, that the one commits me'ilah regarding konamot. This is a topic that we brought up already, but here the Braita we're about to see is the main source of this discussion. And the question is, when you say kunam, you say this is prohibited to me like a korban. That like a korban, does that mean that these oranges have the same law as if it was sacrificial food, and therefore if I benefit from it, I would be committing me'ilah and have to bring korban for that? Or when I say this is like sacrificial food, I'm just saying it's prohibited like it, but it's not, doesn't actually become sacrificial food like a korban. And if I eat it, I would not commit me'ilah. That is subject to a machloket in the following baraita. Vehatanya kikar zo hekdesh va'achala. Someone says this loaf of bread is hekdesh. That means regular hekdesh, consecrated, and then he eats it. Ben hu ben chavero ma'al. By making it consecrated food, that makes it prohibited not only to himself, but to everyone else in the world. And therefore, anyone who eats it will commit me'ilah and have to bring a korban. Now, there's a benefit to that also, a leniency, which is that one can redeem it. Just like one can redeem any item that's consecrated, kiddushat damim, one can redeem it and put the kedusha on the money. So too, this hekdesh, by making it actually like consecrated food, the stringency is that you commit me'ilah if you eat it, but the leniency is that you can redeem it. Now compare that to kikar zo alai hekdesh. If someone says, this loaf of bread is prohibited to me as something consecrated, only to me, but not to anybody else. Harehu ma'al, chavero lo ma'al. So then if he eats it, he commits me'ilah. If someone else eats it, they do not commit me'ilah because he only made it for himself. Lefichach en la pijon dibre Rabbi Meir, and therefore he cannot redeem it. You see, because he made the prohibition only upon himself, it's not like regular consecration. If it's really regular consecrated, then it would be prohibited to everyone. And then the leniency that comes along with that is that you could redeem it. But by making it prohibited only to himself, so he will commit me'ilah because he did make it consecrated to himself, but it's a special kind of consecration that only applies to him, not to everybody else, and therefore you cannot redeem it. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that there is me'ilah in kunamot, saying that this thing is prohibited to me as hekdesh is the same as a kunam, because a kunam also says applies to me. This thing is prohibited to me as kunam. So if you're so just like he says hadehu ma'al here, Rabbi Meir would say yesh me'ilah bakunamot. But we're not asking about Rabbi Meir, we're asking about Rabbanan, and they say chachamim omedim ben hu ben chavero lo ma'al levi she'en me'ilah bakunamot. If someone says this loaf is prohibited to me as hekdesh, then if he's not allowed to eat it, but if he does, it's not me'ilah, he doesn't bring korban, and certainly there's no prohibition against everybody else. Why? Because according to Chamim, there is no me'ilah bekunamot. So, on the one hand, Chamim say in this baraita, and me'ilah bekunamot. But Ravina, by saying that the Rabbanan in the baraita require shaveh piruta, well, you'd only need shaveh piruta to be liable to a korban because you think that there yesh me'ilah bakunamot. You would only have to bring a korban if you think yesh me'ilah bakunamot. So Ravina, which one is it? You think that according to Rabbanan yesh me'ilah bakunamot? This baraita says the opposite. And the answer is epuch. Okay, we'll switch around the opinions in that baraita. Echad zeh ve'echad zeh lo ma'al, lefi she'en me'ilah bakunamot Rabbi Meir. Hachamim omrim hu ma'al, chavero lo ma'al. We're going to switch it around and say Rabbi Meir is the one that says that both he and anyone else who eats that does not commit me'ilah because Rabbi Meir says no me'ilah bakunamot. And Chamim say he does. If someone says this will be prohibited to me, he does commit me'ilah if he eats it, and his friend does not because yesh me'ilah bakunamot. Okay, so now we resolve that problem for Ravina. But that creates a new problem. Yachid b'meir omed kunamot kishvuot, ela kunamot istarufehu de la mistarufeh hame'ilah itbehu. Wait, but Rabbi Meir in the baraita above said in the original formula, we happen to switch it around to answer a question, but that was just to answer a question. What you see from here is that when we say switch it around, we're just saying, okay, maybe we have to switch it around, and we could try to do that in order to answer the question. It doesn't mean that we're actually going to switch around that baraita when we said for Rabbi Meir, don't read kunamot kishvuot, read shevuot kekunamot. Okay, so that was just to answer a question, but it's not the official language of the baraita. So now we're going back to the official language of the baraita, where Rabbi Meir said kunamot, one are separate, just like Shevuot, just like regarding Shevuot, one does not combine the apples and oranges to make up a kezait. So to kunamot, one does not combine them to make up a shiur. So that was the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Okay, so kunamot, he's saying that they don't join together, fine, but if you eat a sufficient amount of one, then that implies that there would be me'ilah. He's saying, okay, they don't join together, but if you have enough of one, then there is me'ilah. And that was the opinion of Rabbi Meir. So that means Rabbi Meir says that yesh me'ilah. V'hama Rabbi Meir en me'ilah b'kunamot kelal, but you went by switching around this baraita, that Rabbi Meir says en me'ilah, so then he should never have to bring korban, even if he eats a kezait. So what does Rabbi Meir's statement back in that earlier baraita mean? And the answer is Rabbi Meir was only saying an argument On behalf of Rabbanan, according to Rabbanan, he's saying as follows: Lididi en me'ila b'kunamot kelal. I think that there's no kunamot, there's no me'ilah regarding kunamot. So no matter how much he eats from apples or oranges or both together, it doesn't matter. He's not going to bring korban. There is a prohibition. He said kunam, I'm not allowed, but there's no me'ilah and therefore no korban, no matter how much he eats. That's what I think. But my challenge to you is lididchu oduli mihat kunamot kishvuot. But even according to you, where you think that there is me'ilah and kunamot, you should at least agree that they should not join together. That just like regarding Shevuot, you have to have a whole amount of apples or a full kezayit of oranges in order to be liable, then kunamot should be the same thing. Why are you saying that they join together for kunamot and they don't join together for Shevuot? That was Rabbi Meir's question. His question was only ledivrechem v'Rabbanan, and how would Rabbanan answer that? The answer is, as we said before, Shevuot ikad Pinchas, kunamot leka. Pinchas. When it comes to Shevuot, we apply the logic of Pinchas, who says, regarding Shevuot, if you say, I'm not going to eat, and you have a whole list, we consider each thing on the list separate for Korban Chatat. You have to bring multiple Korban Chatats, and therefore also we consider it separate in that they don't join together. But Kunamot, the logic of Pinchas does not apply to Kunamot, and therefore that's why the rabbis say we're not going to join together different items for Shevuot, but we will join together different items for the sake of Kunamot. Amar Rava, Shevuah shelo ochal v'achal afar patur. Now Rava is going to ask a couple of questions. We saw this one already quoted somewhat. Now we're going to see the full source of Rava's question. If someone says, vow that I'm not going to eat, and he eats dirt, he is not liable, because eating dirt is not called eating. Even though it's technically going in your mouth and going down your throat, that's not called eating, and therefore he does not violate his vow. That's clear. Ba'erava, shewa shelo ochal afar bechama, kevan de'amar shelo ochal da'ateh kezait, o de'ma kevan de'lav midi de'achli enashehu bechol shehu teko. Here's Rava's question. If someone makes a vow, I'm not going to eat dirt, so he specified dirt in his vow, then he will violate if he eats dirt. The question is, how much dirt does he have to eat to violate? Since he says, I'm not going to eat dirt, and he used the verb eat, so he has in mind kezait. It's really psychological. What did the person have in mind? So just like eating in general is a kezait, so too when he says, I'm not going to eat dirt, he figures the same amount. That's what he has in mind is prohibiting. So only if he eats a kezait, then he's liable. Or do we say that since eating dirt, nobody there's not something that people eat. It's not an edible thing. Therefore, even if he eats a little bit of dirt, he is liable, because it's not an act of eating. When you say eat and regarding food, then you mean an act of eating of something that is a significant amount of food, that is a kezait. But since this is not edible, so therefore the standard definitions of food, which is a kezait, do not apply to dirt because it's not food, and therefore he would be liable even for a little bit. Teko, we leave this question standing. By Rava, another question. Shewa shelo ochal harsan bechama. Someone says, I'm not going to eat grape seeds. So how much would he have to eat in order to be liable? On the one hand, you can say, well, people do eat grape seeds when they're joined together with other food. Let's say you eat a whole grape with the seed in it, and you chew and swallow the whole thing. So grape seeds are somewhat edible, and therefore it's the same as any vow regarding a food, that it will be a kezait. Or would you say that nobody eats grape seeds on their own? If you had a pile of grape seeds that you separated out, those are not very edible. Nobody would eat them, and therefore they're considered not edible. And so if someone makes a vow on them and even eats a little bit of grape seed, then they would be liable because it's not food, it's not edible. So the standard definition of food, kezait, does not apply to them. So this is a follow-up question. You see, dirt is not edible at all, no matter what. And so if you would say, well, dirt, that would be a kol shehu. If you say dirt is a kezait, then certainly grape seeds, you would require a kezait. But if you say regarding dirt, that even a small amount, even kol shehu, would make one liable because it's completely not edible, would you say the same thing about grape seeds, because grape seeds are somewhat edible, that if they're mixed into something else, then not everybody spits it out. They might just eat it. Or do you say, well, by itself it's not edible, so then it would be the same as dirt? And that question is also left standing. Now, regarding the grape seeds, if we assume that the grape seeds is in fact kezait, then we have a follow-up question to that. Ba'erav ashe, nazir shamar shewa shelo ochal charsan bechama. A nazir, he already said I'm a nazir, which means he's prohibited from wine and even grapes and any part of grapes, even the skin, even the seed. So he's already prohibited from eating seeds as a nazir, but that law, the nazir deoraita law, is only for a kezait. And then, while he's in nazir, he says an additional vow: I'm not going to eat grape seeds. So how much would he have to eat in order to be liable? Or dilma kevan de'amar shelo ochal datea kezait. We can argue in two ways. Since, according to the Torah, as a nazir, only a kezait of grape seeds is prohibited to him. So when he makes a vow, he's making a vow he has in mind even kol shehu of grape seeds is prohibited, so he's adding an additional prohibition to what he was prohibited to before. Before, being just a nazir, he was only prohibited to a kezait. When he makes a vow, I'm not going to eat even a little bit, so then maybe he has in mind, since he's already prohibited for a kezait, maybe now he has in mind, I'm going to add more to my prohibition and prohibit even kol shehu, and therefore that vow will apply because it creates an additional prohibition. That's one side. Or maybe, since he said shelo ochal, I just said I'm not going to eat, he's thinking of the standard eating, which is a kezait. And since he's already prohibited as a kezait to eat a kezait, because he's a nazir, so this vow will not apply, because that's the rule. A vow does not apply on something that is already prohibited to him. So, assuming that we answered Ava's question over here, that for grape seeds it's a kezait, that would be the second one. But or you might say, since he's already prohibited in the kezait, why would he bother making a vow? He must mean that it's a kol shehu. That's the two sides of this question, and we're going to try to answer it from this Mishnah that we've already studied earlier yesterday. Tashema shewa shelo ochal v'achal nevelot utrefot shekasim urmasim chayav v'Rabbi Shimon poter v'avinan ba amai chayav. If someone takes a vow, I'm not going to eat tomorrow, so not going to eat anything, and then he eats non-kosher food, nebela, terefa, creepy crawlies, he is liable according to Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon says he is not liable. Now we understand Rabbi Shimon why he says he's not liable, since he was already prohibited to eat nevelot utrefot from Har Sinai. Therefore, the vow did not add any new prohibition to the nevelot and terefot, and therefore he's not liable for violating the Shevuot. He is liable for eating nevelot utrefot, but not for an added Shevuah. But how about Tanakama? Why do they say it's liable if he was already prohibited from those same things? Mushbava med Har Sinaihu. Why don't they say, as Rabbi Shimon would, that he's everybody already vowed on Har Sinai that we're not going to eat nevelot utrefot shekasim urmasim? Rav Shmuel Rabbi Yochanan Damre Bechol Devarim Hamutarim Ayim Devarim Asurim. Rab and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, they all give one explanation, because he is including permitted things along with the prohibited things. Since the vow says I'm not going to eat anything tomorrow, I'm not going to eat even kosher food tomorrow, so since it applies to things that were permitted to him, so therefore the entire vow applies. And if on the next day he eats nevelot, he's liable for eating nevela, and he's also liable for violating the oath, because the oath does apply as long as the oath includes more than that which was already prohibited. That's one answer. But our question is going to be from our attempted answer to Rav Asher's question is going to be from Resh Lakish's explanation. Resh Lakish Amar, אי אתה מוסה אלא אי במפרש חסי שיעור ואליבא דרבנן. אי בסתם ואליבא דרבי עקיבא. דאמר אדם מוסר עצמו בכל שהוא. Resh Lakish says, I'll tell you what it means. According to Tanakama, when are you liable? it's if you specify. In other words, nebelan terefa, according to the Torah, is only if you eat a certain amount, only if you eat a kezayit. Okay, so a person is already liable already from Har Sinai to eat a kezayit. And Resh Lakish says, we're talking about a case where either according to Rabbanan, and he specified, I'm not going to eat tomorrow, even a little bit, even chasi shi'ur. So then the vow adds more prohibition to that which was before, even for nebela. Before he was only prohibited from eating a kezayit nebela, now he cannot eat any nebela, and that's why he is liable. Or you could say that he made just a regular vow, I'm not going to eat tomorrow, and we follow the Rabbi Akiva, who says that when a person makes a vow, he means even to eat a little bit, because a vow is different from general prohibitions. General prohibitions is an act of eating, but a vow is regarding the words that he says, and a person means I'm not going to eat even a little bit, and therefore the vow applies to adds a prohibition to a bigger amount, and that was before. Okay, now we're going to bring the proof. Now we're going to compare nevela to grape seeds. Just like a nevela, it's like you made a vow from Har Sinai regarding a kezayit, and if you, according to the Shakish, add another prohibition, another vow to that includes kol shehu, then that vow applies to it. Well, we could say the same thing for a nazir. Grape seeds for a nazir is prohibited only as a kezayit, the same as nebela is to any Jew. V'tama de parish, hala parish da'tea kezayit shmamina. And yet, according to the Shakish, the only reason why he would be liable to bring korban, would be liable for violating his oath, is if he specified, this oath I'm not going to eat even a tiny bit, only if he specifies. We're following Rabbanan. But if he didn't specify, we don't assume that since he's already prohibited from a nebela, he must, when he makes a vow, it must mean that he has in mind that he wants to add more prohibition and add even kol shehu. We don't say that regarding nebela. Rather, we say that if he does not specify, then he means a kezayit, and therefore, if he just said nebela, it would not apply to nebela. And according to the Shakish, even if he says a blanket, I won't eat anything tomorrow, then that vow will not apply to nevela. He goes and eats nevela, and he didn't specify, so then he was already prohibited from nevela, and this vow did not add anything to the nevela prohibition, and so he would not he would not be liable for violating the vow. That's the Shakish's opinion. And so we can apply the same logic to Charzan, the grapeseed. The Nazir was already prohibited. He said, I'm not going to eat grapeseed. He didn't specify anything, so we don't assume that he must amend kol shehu. Rather, we say, well, he just said the normal formula. The normal formula is a kezayit, and a prohibition of kezayit is already there, so there is no new prohibition. And so we can actually answer Rav Asher's question that we do not assume kol shehu. This is a redundant vow. It's already prohibited to him, and therefore he is not liable for violating the vow if he eats a kezayit he is not liable for violating the vow if he eats a kol shehu of grapeseed, and if he eats a kezayit, then he would be liable only for being a nazir, but would not violate the vow. Ela tifshot ba'erava, shivua shelo ochal afar bechama, tifshot ad ika kezayit, taha nebela ke'afar damya v'tama de parish, hala parish ta'tea kezayit. Now that we understand this logic, why can't we apply it to the first question of Rava? When someone says, I make a vow that I'm not going to eat dirt, and he asked, well, how much dirt? Is it the same as regular food, like a kezayit, or since it's not edible, it applies even to a kol shehu? So we can use the logic that we just said in order to answer that it has to be a kezayit, because look, nevela is not edible. I'm not allowed to eat nevela. You're not allowed to eat nevela, and so a nevela is like dirt because both are unedible. And yet we say, according to the Shakish, the Shevuot would only apply if you specified it's going to be a kol shehu. But if you don't specify, then we assume that the person has in mind eating a kezayit. And even though because it's not, even though it's not edible, just like a nebela is not edible, and yet we assume that he means a kezait. So too regarding dirt, even though it's not edible, we assume that he means to only make himself liable in the Shevuot if he has a kezait. Isn't that a good proof? And we answer, no. La afar la bat achilahu kelal, nebela bat achila ve'aryahu derbiya illa vaha. The non-edibleness of dirt and of non-kosher meat is different. Dirt is not edible at all, not to anybody, not at any time. Whereas nevela is edible. You have there's a cow that died somehow, and not through kosher shechita, and so it's a nevela. Now the meat is edible. It's the same meat as kosher meat. The problem is that it's as if a lion is crouching on it. So if you come and you're hungry and you see a cow and a lion is crouching on it, the meat is technically edible if you could get to it, but you can't get to it because there is a lion that will attack you if you try to take it. So in practice, you can't get it even though the meat technically is edible. We're comparing the lion to the prohibition. The Torah says don't eat nevela. The nevela animal, the meat is edible for a human being, and a non-Jew could eat it. That's the proof. Just that to a Jew, it's not edible only because of the prohibition. You're not allowed to eat it, but it is edible, so that's not the same as dirt. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.